Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you all and welcome to the channel. In this video we will start with object-oriented programming bi'idhnillah. We will cover what are the main aspects of object-oriented programming, and then we will start tackling each aspect individually in hopes of creating a culmination of the object-oriented programming experience in this course. But before we begin, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashraf al-anbiya'i wal-mursaleen, Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin, warda Allahumma anna ma'hum ajma'in, Allahumma ameen. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, kama sallayta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim, wa barik ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim, innaka hamidun majid. Now let us begin with object-oriented programming. As we discussed in, I believe, the first video, if I recall correctly, object-oriented programming is programming that revolves around creation of objects. And as we mentioned before, an object is an instance of a class that can be represented computationally as opposed to being represented graphically or visually. But we will discuss objects in detail, inshallah, once we cover classes and class types. But for now, we will cover the 4 pillars of object-oriented programming, or if you would like to know if a particular programming language is an object-oriented programming language or if it is a procedural programming language, you check these 4 pillars. Those should provide you with an idea about the nature of the programming language. Though be forewarned, there are procedural programming languages or interpreted programming languages that do not have object-oriented programming, but they do have certain aspects of it, even though they are not fully defined as an object-oriented programming language. They do have aspects of that, such as JavaScript, for example, if I recall correctly, or PHP, if I recall correctly. So let us take a look and see what are the 4 pillars of object-oriented programming. So these 4 main categories are what constitute object-oriented programming. However, one of them has a subcategory. I will mention it, but we will mention it by default regardless when we cover its respective lecture, inshallah. Okay. The first pillar is known as encapsulation. And as the name suggests, encapsulation is placing in a capsule, which is a popular pharmaceutical term, but encapsulation in programming involves compartmentalization. That is basically what it is. Encapsulation is compartmentalization, or creating actually, let me change the color here to red. Classes. When you create a class, you are encapsulating the information. And there is also another component of encapsulation other than classes, but that revolves around access specifiers, which we will discuss in their own lecture, inshallah. But when you create a class, you encapsulate the information because you are compartmentalizing every piece of code or source code in its respective class or in its proper class. And those are compartmentalized even further in packages. The second pillar we have is known as inheritance. And a subcategory of inheritance is known as polymorphism. The word poly means multiple, and morph means shape, and ism is a suffix that means pertaining to. Pertaining to multiple shapes. And if you are unfamiliar with medical terminology, this is how you define a term. You start from the suffix, then return to the prefix. After that, you move on to the root. So you read this first in English, then this in English, then this in English. Pertaining to multiple forms. And we will cover that lengthily when we cover, inshallah, inheritance and how classes can inherit one another, and what are subclasses and superclasses, and what is polymorphism, and the types of polymorphism, dynamic and static. Then we have realization, and that involves the creation of a class type. So classes are a class type. There is another class type known as an interface, and we will cover those in their own video, inshallah. So the realization process involves the creation of interfaces. Lastly, we have abstraction. Maybe if I can elongate it in this direction. Yep. An abstraction involves the creation of yet another class type, and this is known as an abstract class. We will cover abstract classes separately from simple classes, because classes have generic, static, final, default, and 5 classes: abstract class, default or simple, generic, static, and final classes. So we will cover abstract classes. Actually, we will cover probably each class separately. That way it is easier for everyone to understand. But these main pillars are what comprise object-oriented programming. If you have these pillars, then most likely your programming language that you are utilizing is an object-oriented programming. If you are able to create classes, inherit these classes, realize these classes through interfaces, or abstract the classes, then this is object-oriented programming. And that is it for the first lesson in object-oriented programming. I apologize if the journey took so long to reach the important portion of Java, but I wish to provide a proper foundational structure for procedural programming before we venture into object-oriented programming, since certain portions of object-oriented programming will rely heavily on procedural programming, such as arrays, which are classes, and their reliance on for loops, which are procedural programming aspects. So inshallah, after this lesson, we will delve deeper into object-oriented programming. After we are done with this second section of the course, we will cover the infrastructure of Java, such as the definition of a Java virtual machine, what is the compiler used in Java, the memory management, stack and heap, and the data engines, and so on and so forth, in addition to processor architecture, so that you can have a general understanding of how a computer runs or executes a program, especially with linking and loading. That way, inshallah, when we start the C programming language course, it will be much easier, at least in my opinion, because I learned Java first, then I learned C, and I realized that understanding Java helped with understanding C, because C can be slightly confusing if you start with it. In my opinion, that is, you may find the opposite is true. That is, of course, your preference. My preference is that learning Java beforehand simplifies learning other programming languages, especially Python, because Python writes itself sometimes. Well, I hope this video was helpful and beneficial to you all. Enjoy the rest of your day. Be safe, take care, and peace be upon you all. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim wa barik ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka hamidun majid.